Now, let's get to media freedom and those police raids last week. There are some serious issues to consider here, and I'll speak to some experts in just a moment. But first, you know how shrill a lot of the coverage has been. But what about the hypocrisy of many in the media and in politics? Have a look at this from outgoing ABC Insiders host Barry Cassidy last week.
And who would have thought that the topic in my last week in 2019 would be freedom of the press? A freedom, quite frankly, facing its most serious challenge in decades. This is not alarmist language, it's not hyperbole, it's a real and present danger. Not for nothing did the New York Times this week pose the question, is Australia the world's most secretive democracy? The AFP says this was just a standard operation, and so why all the suspicion? That's why it smacks of politics. It looks like a big show put on simply to deter whistleblowers and investigative journalists. The ABC story was clearly in the national interest. National security was not the issue. As the Law Council has pointed out, the problem arose from changes to the Criminal Code in 2018. Those changes did not ensure that the media would never be accused of a crime simply for publishing material in the public interest, material that went to misconduct or maladministration by governments or others. That has to be rectified as a bottom line. Otherwise, Australia could drift dangerously close to a police state.
Now, on its own merits, this is a reasonable argument, except for the hysterical references to a police state and the like. Police raids are a concern, and we need to discuss protections for whistleblowers and journalists in order to protect the public interest. Many journalists and politicians are now claiming to be warriors for free speech.
At every moment along the way, Barry, Labor has had concern for the national interest to make sure that we are protecting journalists' freedoms and the freedom of the press.
The telling point here, though, is that Labor is beating the drum of press freedom now when the last time it was in power, just 6 years ago, it put up laws to provide de facto regulation of the print media. This was a draconian plan. It would have seen a government watchdog supervise the Press Council, forcing compliance with its content demands. And it would have imposed a nebulous public interest test on media deals, a level of government control over print media never seen before. Many of us objected to it strongly at the time, but incredibly, many journalists, especially at the ABC, were willing to roll over, as the Daily Telegraph's Piers Ackerman pointed out on Insiders in 2013.
Now, you and I are old enough, but it seemed that a generation of people in caucus aren't, old enough to remember that in November 1989 the Berlin Wall came down. Right, and there was euphoria across the world at the liberation of a shackled people.
Okay, where are you going with this?
Well, one of the things that
Stalin link again.
One of the things that the Soviet Union and every despotic totalitarian government has always done is attack the freedom of the press.
Piers Ackerman, the human headline. Here we go.
This,
and in what way?
I can't believe that I'm sitting on a program with three journalists, and you think that freedom of the press is a laughing matter. I am absolutely I can't believe this, Karen.
Give us a chance, Piers. Give us a chance.
A chance? Well, what? Go on, laugh now, and I'll finish. Because this is what this government is trying to do in a backdoor manner is pick up the cobbles of the Berlin Wall and reconstruct the same sort of totalitarian control on the media.
Can we go back to East? Do you think there's been some hysterical reaction to this?
I say nothing. Barry, I'm sorry.
In what way is this such a monumental attack on freedom of speech?
On freedom of the press.
And freedom of
Because you said when you're talking to the laughing minister over there a few minutes ago, once you have a government-appointed authority who has oversight.
I'm just
to ensure that the regulator does what the regulator says it will
exactly,
do. Yes.
Then that regulator becomes answerable to the government. Why are Australians so passive?
Did the proprietors have it coming?
Given
the examples that Stephen Conroy gave us and the evidence that was led at the inquiry, did the proprietors have this coming because of their attitude towards it?
Wow, did the media have it coming? Well done, Piers Ackerman. Despite the acquiescence of insiders and the ABC, objections by News Corp and Fairfax and other media organisations saw those laws or those proposed laws dropped. It goes to show we need to be ever vigilant for freedom of the press and freedom of expression. Journalists and others shouldn't pick and choose when they fight, depending on which side of politics is proposing the changes. Let's get into this issue now with three people who are intimately involved in it. I'm joined on the desk here by Peter Wilkinson, who's the chair of the Alliance for Journalist Freedoms. Thanks for joining us, Peter.
Thanks, Chris.
And in Melbourne, we're joined by Senator James Paterson, who's had a bit to say on this, and also by Justin Quill, who's a media lawyer. He does a lot of work for News Corp, I should say, and other media companies. Thanks for joining us, gentlemen. Let's start with you, Peter. These raids, in many ways, are well-timed for you. You and Peter Grester, who we've had on the show previously, are pushing for legislation to protect journalists' freedom and whistleblowers. You've been making that push hard for a couple of months. These raids just underline every concern that you've been expressing.
Yes, we could hope it hadn't been that way, but yes, we announced the need for a Media Freedom Act in February. We issued a white paper that was put together hundreds of hours by Gilbert and Tobin, the legal firm Gilbert and Tobin, earlier in May, and coincidentally this has happened since, and it's become very poignant, of course, because it points exactly to the issues that we've been talking about. Before this happened, it was all very sort of theoretical and pie in the sky. This could happen because the legislation is set up to provide for these things to happen. And well, federal police raided last week.
Indeed, it is happening. Let's go to Justin Quill. Justin, from your point of view, though, it's not the journalists that are in the frame here, is it? The police have said what they're looking to do is get evidence to possibly prosecute people inside government who have made these classified leaks.
Look, that's right, but it really should be cold comfort to the journalists and therefore to the public at large, because this is the way it happens. And people have been focusing on the more recent, I think, 2008 amendments to the national legislation, but this has been going on for a while, where the journalist becomes, if you like, collateral damage in a wider police hunt for sources that embarrass governments or government agency. I've acted for many journalists in this situation. Perhaps two of the best known are the two journalists, Harvey McManus, Herald Sun reporters in Canberra. Exactly the same situation.
Now they risked, just to refresh our memories, they risked going to jail for refusing to reveal their sources, quite obviously standing by their ethics, but were fortunate in the end not to go to jail.
Yes, that's right. Although, and in that case, they were just exposing a very bad government policy to take away war widows' pensions. That was quickly changed and thrown out. The source of that leak was then pursued. The police charged someone that they said was the source. Harvey McManus refused to reveal the source, and they were charged with contempt of court and found guilty. They've now got convictions for contempt of court, making international travel, amongst other things, very hard to do. So, you know, real serious consequences for two individuals doing nothing but their job in the public interest. So this has been happening for a long time. The AFP this week, or last week I should say, might be able to say, look, the journalists are not our aim, not our target. But as I say, that should be cold comfort to them and the public.
As you say, it has been happening for a long time. There have been other instances, but I suppose we are getting more and more anti-terror and megadata, national security laws. So there is more problems there for both whistleblowers and for journalists. James Paterson, you're obviously a government member of the Senate, but you've had a long-standing interest in issues of freedom of expression and freedom of the press. You're already on the record as saying that we should look at legislation, that the government should look at legislation to actually protect journalist freedom?
Chris, what I'm suggesting is that we convene an inquiry or review of some sort to consider the way in which particularly national security legislation, and particularly in the digital era, is encroaching on the ability of journalists to do their job, but also on the public's right to know and the public's right to be informed. I think in your opening, Chris, you made a very good point that a lot of the rhetoric has been really over the top this week. I think the comparisons to Tiananmen Square and the accusations of a police state are really problematic. But having said that, that doesn't mean that there isn't a serious underlying issue here. And I want to take up a point that's been expressed this week about the potential chilling effect of activity like this. I was concerned about the chilling effect when it was being deployed against Andrew Bolt in Section 18C, and I'm concerned about it in this instance as well. I think we need to be consistent in our support for press freedom, as you said.
Well, this is one of the points that's really frustrated me. I look at the Andrew Bolt case when many at the ABC and in various political parties were cheering, and the same when we had the Queensland University students and Bill Leak pursued by 18C. And I've just shown, Peter, how they were scoffing at concerns about the Labor Party's de facto regulation of the print media. You've got to be consistent on press freedom, otherwise it'll come up and hit you as it's done this week.
And I agree with Senator Paterson. The idea of an inquiry is really valuable because that'll give us a chance a bit further down the track to have a look at this and just, when the heat's gone out of it, to...
Well, it's a good starting point, isn't it? Because no doubt any legislation would end up going to a committee. Why not get a committee that might come up with some sort of bipartisan recommendation?
Yeah, and Justin's point too also, I think any kind of review needs to include looking at whistleblowers because you can't just protect journalists so that they can do their work. You have to protect their sources as well. A journalist, as you know, is only as good as his or her sources. And there were many times when I had to give a commitment when I was a journalist that I would not under any circumstances reveal sources, or at other times I'd say,
sure,
if this goes to court, I'll have to give you up. So just be aware of the consequences of that.
The trouble here, Justin, is the balancing rights and responsibilities. Now, I've received leaks in the past as a journalist, but I've also worked in government and ended up having top secret security clearance myself. I know what it's like to have that responsibility. And the idea with any catch-all law that protects journalists and whistleblowers, you've got to somehow guard against a situation where those security classifications are just meaningless. I mean, they are there for a reason. And there is no doubt that at times maybe some governments do abuse them, or some bureaucrats might abuse them, classifying things higher than they need be. But we need to have secure national communications and intelligence reports. We need that for our own security, and we need it to maintain our intelligence and security relationships with our allies.
Look, there's no doubt about that. I think it's important in this discussion to remember the two raids and the stories that they related to. In my view, nobody could suggest seriously that those two stories weren't in the public interest. And it's important to therefore say that's the sort of protection that we're looking to afford. But it's not easy, and the drafting of legislation won't be easy. If it were, I'd probably be able to tell you exactly how it ought to be drafted right now. I love the idea of that James has put forward of an inquiry, because that's what we need. I was disappointed and concerned. I felt Scott Morrison's words last week were pretty hollow. It's one thing to say we support press freedom, but it's quite another to actually put in place some mechanism for protecting that press freedom. So an inquiry is a very good start. That's what we need ultimately. We need protection, and as has already been said, not just for the journalists, and certainly not for the journalists' sake alone. This is for the wider public. So
it's
it has
got
to be,
yeah,
not just.
Chris, it's got to be for the public interest.
We can
exactly.
do both. We can do both.
Yeah, absolutely.
You can have a buffer law, a shield law, up against which these various pieces of legislation that have been passed over the last few years and more recently quite regularly, up against which they bump, so that when legislators are creating new laws, they have to consider this law, and when the judges are making decisions, they have to consider this law. So, I mean, Justin, am I right in saying that you can do both? Sorry to talk
absolutely. No, not at all. Absolutely you can. And I should say, the point was made earlier that we've got to be consistent. This is not just, we're not just talking about national security. You look at the Andrew Bolt case and indeed the Bill Leak case. I might say, just as a matter of full disclosure, I acted for both Andrew and Bill in those cases. But whatever we come up with ought to cover those situations as well.
Yeah, it's got to cover corporate whistleblowers as well, like Jeff Morris and the like. But I suppose the issue here is, James, there can be retrospective court action to protect people after a leak has happened and the story has been published. Then you have to assess whether stories are in the public interest. I mean, I agree with Justin. The two stories we've referred to definitely have been in the public interest. But at some stage, people have to make those judgments, and those judgments are going to be made by the whistleblower and by the journalist and the media organisation to get them out there. Presumably, these court actions to protect them can only come into effect after that.
Well, Chris, my general, without preempting an inquiry that hasn't even been called yet, let alone heard evidence, but my general legislative preference is that where we have these competing priorities in law, where we have to balance them, that we do them, that the Parliament does them in a very precise and very targeted way in the relevant piece of legislation. I'm a little bit reluctant to have generic standalone press freedom laws or press freedom principles enacted in law, which then a court or a judge has to choose how to balance those things. I think Parliament is better equipped to decide how those things are balanced because we're elected to do that job. Judges, I would much rather just be there to apply the law rather than make effectively moral or value-based judgments about competing principles.
Well, Peter Wilkinson, you've got a government senator pushing for an inquiry. Your job now
judges,
is...
by the way, make decisions on law all the time.
They do all the time.
And that's the problem with defamation, is it's been whittled away, which is why you've had these bizarre decisions over the last, with Rebel Wilson and the more recent one.
Sure, we'll have another discussion like this about defamation law sometime down the track, but at the moment you've got a coalition senator pushing for an inquiry. What you want to do is try and get the same sort of buy-in from the Labor Party, and you're off and running.
Totally agree with it.
Thanks so much for joining us, Peter. Appreciate your time. Justin Quill and James Paterson as well. There we go. We've got the push forward for a parliamentary inquiry. It would seem the sensible first step in resolving what's become a very vexed issue here. Going to take a break now. Back with a panel to look at some of the big issues of the week, including whether it's been the right of centre radio stations that have done best out of the election campaign.